This was one of the first hands I played of the session. A middle-aged guy with a ponytail opened to $20. I hadn't seen too many hands. He seemed a little bit more outgoing and extrovert, so I assumed he was a little bit more on the loose side. Middle position called, low jack called. I decided to 3-bet with the king of hearts, queen of spades. Not really a hand that I want to play multi-way. It plays pretty poor multi-way, not being suited, and calling here I think brings in more players from behind. I decided to 3-bet to 100, probably a little bit on the loose side versus early position open, but again I think this player seems to be loose and I think I would rather squeeze this than call this. Folding's probably an option too, but it seemed a little bit on the tight side. So it gets around to the under the gun player. He calls and both of the other players fold. So we go heads up to a pot of 244. The flop is the 8 of hearts, 2 of hearts, 2 of clubs. I think I'm almost exclusively using a large size here. My standard is about a 60% pot in 3-bet pots. I think I have a massive nut advantage here with a lot of the overpairs, and I think my opponent is a little bit more capped towards weaker pocket pairs, ace high here. So I bet 135. He elects to call. When he does call, I do think a lot of his range is these medium pocket pairs, ace high and some flush draws. I would expect some raises from some of the stronger pocket pairs and probably some of the flush draws. I could see pocket eights going either way from his point of view. The turn is the 4 of spades, so pretty much a complete blank here. He checks. I think my hand can go either way. I decided to check behind. I think generally if I have king queen here without a heart, it's probably just a pure check. I think with a heart it's mixed here and I can barrel off rivers with another heart that comes, or things like ace, or bet for value with a king or a queen. I think it's a mix. I think it can go either way. I think exploitatively it's probably better to bet here if I'm planning to bet river on high cards and hearts, just because I think players are more apt to think that your story doesn't really make sense, and they're more apt to fold some of their medium pocket pairs and their ace highs on the river, which kind of comes up here. The river is the 10 of hearts. My opponent checks. I think he's relatively capped at this point when he checks. I think his stronger pocket pairs, his sets, his flushes, they would have bet a lot of the time at the river. So I think his range is mostly made up of medium pocket pairs, some ace high, and hands like 9-8, 8-7. I decide that I'm gonna try to get him off of some of these pocket pairs and push on that threshold a little bit. I bet $600 into 550. I think this is possibly a little bit large. I don't know if I need to overbet here. My story from, like I said, an exploitative point of view, from my opponent's point of view, doesn't necessarily make too much sense, because I think my opponent would probably expect me to bet a lot of my overpairs and my flush draws on the turn. I generally try to be a little bit balanced here, so I think I do have some overpairs and I do have flush draws that get to the river and that can bet very large here. I think 10x is definitely in my range here as well, that can bet large for value, but again, maybe I want to be using slightly smaller sizes than this. I would never do this without a heart. I think having essentially the ace of hearts or the king of hearts is mostly where my bluffs are going to stem from. So I think I have a reasonable bluff candidate. I'm just not entirely sure of the sizing. I think I do want to go at least 60% pot and then all the way up to possibly some overbets. But I think most of my overbets are going to stem from my flushes and full houses here. Unfortunately, he snap calls with pocket sevens. He said he decided if I bet on the river, he was just gonna call pretty much no matter what. So unfortunately, this bluff didn't get through. He did have the 7 hearts, so he has a somewhat reasonable bluff catcher blocking some of my flushes, but his hand's definitely a mix and definitely not a snap call. So unfortunately, starting the session off on the wrong foot. This was my second notable hand of the session. I didn't really have too many other notable hands since the king-queen offhand for a while. It became pretty abundantly clear that my table was very call happy. So you'll kind of see this theme throughout the session where most of these hands are just going to be very value heavy. I was doing very little bluffing and just trying to essentially get value hands. There's going to be a lot of multi-way pots and just a lot of calling in general. So this hand is a straddle pot. I opened the low jack with the king of hearts, king of spades, a looser player on my left, an older guy that was playing most pots, calls. Unknown player calls on the button. Another middle-aged older guy calls in the big blinds. And then the straddle, who was the villain in the initial hand, calls as well. So we go to a flop with $126 in the pot. Flop is 853 rainbow. It checks around to me. For the most part, I'm really only using small sizes when we're this many people multi-way. I usually elect for about 33% pot on these very dry boards. I think my specific hand can really go either way. I think there's definitely some merit for gaining value and pushing out some amount of equity with people that can have hands that can hit like random sets or two pairs or weird straights on the turn. But I think this specific hand as well can definitely have some check. There's not as many scare cards on the turn. I think with the flush draw, I'm generally gonna elect to lean towards betting, especially without the king of diamonds. I do bet 40, so about 33% into this pot. The looser, older player on my left calls, button calls, and the other two players fold. We go to the turn, the pot is $246, and the turn is the four of hearts. So this is definitely a turn card that is going to be better for my opponent's range. They're going to be connecting a little bit more here with straights and pair plus straight draws and some two pair combos, especially multi-way when I have multiple callers here. Probably a little less so with players that aren't in the blinds, but still going to be generally better for my opponent's range. I elect to pot control here and just kind of see what happens. I think both options are probably fine with my hand though. It checks to the button and he bets 80 into about 250. I don't think I really want to play my hand as a raise at this point. Again, we're just trying to like really pot control when we're multi-way here. Even versus this small bet, I think I generally just want to elect to call, which I do. The looser older player on my left folds. The river is the 9 of spades. I'm going to continue to check to the aggressor. The pot's about $400. And again, just still trying to pot control. My opponent does have some straights here, they have some sets here, they have some two pair combos here. If they do bet, I'm slightly leaning towards still calling probably in a vacuum. They do still have some missed straight draws here. They have some missed flush draws for sure. But it's kind of a weird spot because they definitely could have some of these stronger hands, and I expect a lot of their 8x combos. So like if they have like 8-7 or 8-6 here or ace-8, a lot of those hands I expect to check back. So it's kind of a weird spot where we're just in a pure bluff catching scenario. Thankfully, my opponent checks back. We show kings and he shows the ace of diamonds, 7 of diamonds. So he picked up a straight draw to go along with his flush draw. So thankfully he did not decide to bet large on the river as a bluff. This is another straddle pot, this time on the button. The small blind folds and the big blind calls. It gets to me under the gun and I open pocket aces to $30. And it folds around back to the big blind and he makes the call. We go to the flop for $67. The flop is the king of hearts, 4 of hearts, 2 of spades. I think for the most part when I'm opening early position, this is generally just going to be a range bet for me. I think either size is viable. My standard sizes are 33% or 75%. I elect to go 75% on this flop. The big blind makes the call. The turn is the 6 of clubs. Relatively blank card overall. Gonna hit the big blind range typically a little bit harder, probably less so when there's a button straddle and he calls with players behind. But I think for the most part, with this being a relatively blank card, I'm only supposed to really be using large sizes. Gonna be using 75% or 150% primarily. I expect to get called by hands like pairs plus a draw and king X, and then it sets me up for river shove when I make a larger bet here. But I think this is just gonna be a pure large bet spot when I have a massive nut advantage still. The younger kid checks and I bet 115. Again, I think this is probably more of an overbet spot in general, but I think with the stack to pot ratio, I think a B75 is more than good here. I can definitely set it up so that there's a pretty easy river shove from my point of view. He makes the call, the pot's 387, my opponent has $240 behind. The river is the 10 of clubs. 10 of clubs never really improves my opponent's range unless they have exactly king 10. I think once it checks to me, I have a very clear shove for value. Again, mostly gonna get called by king X hands and then some stubborn hands that were like a pair plus a draw. I should be winning here the vast majority of the time. So that's what I do. And the younger kid tanks and eventually he does make the call and we scoop. We are dealt aces here again in middle position. A player from early position limps. I raise to 20. The looser older guy on my left calls. A looser player on the small blind calls. A regular in the big blind calls, and then the original limper calls. We go to the flop for $100. The flop is the 10 of hearts, 5 of diamonds, 2 of clubs. It checks to me. Similar to the king-king hand earlier, I think I want to be using either small sizes, so a B33 for me generally, or just checking back. This board is a little bit more dry than some of the other ones, and there's not really too many scare cards, so I think this is definitely a hand that can check back at some frequency. I don't mind betting either, again, just trying to push out equity from some hands that have straights, that can hit sets, that can hit weird 2 pairs. Obviously some of those are gonna elect to call flop anyways. I elect to bet 35 into 100. The loose player on my left calls and it folds to the initial limper and he calls. For the most part, when they call here, I think their range is gonna be some straight draws, a decent amount of 10x and a little bit of 5x and a little bit of 2x. I think generally people are calling a little bit too frequently with some of their 5x and 2x here, some of their weaker hands. I think there's also going to be some number of hands that are things like pocket 3s, pocket 4s, pocket 6s, pocket 7s. I think a lot of those should generally be folds when we're going 5 ways to the flop and the initial aggressor is betting into the field. But we go to the turn for $205, 3 ways. The turn is the 9 of hearts. Not a card that should generally improve my opponent's range too much, especially with me having the ace of hearts. I don't expect there to be too many draws that pick up equity. They could definitely have a hand like 10-9, where for the most part, the 9 is going to be a pretty innocuous card. I think I'm supposed to probably be using larger sizes because of that. So I think I make a slight mistake. I guess I do bet 130 into 205, but I think I could probably go slightly larger than that as well. Again, multi-way, I'm going to be using smaller sizes generally and trying to pot control a little bit. The looser player on my left calls the 130 and the initial limper calls the 130. We go to the river to about $600 in the pot. The river is the 8 of spades. Not a card that is going to improve my opponent's range too much. I think there's going to be a little bit of 7-6 there. The player on my left is definitely a looser player, calling a lot of bets in general here. And then I think if it gets to the unknown player, I think he can make some calls at some frequency with 7-6 getting better pot odds. Definitely 7-6 of hearts is here. The other one's less so. I think my opponents could have a couple more 2-pair combos, some 10-9, some 10-8 here. I think it's a little bit more likely multi-way that my hand is not good, but I think that for the most part I should probably be good on this river. It checks to me. I elect to check back here. That's probably a little bit tight. I think my thought process at the time was having the ace of hearts. There's not too many draws here at this point. I also block hands like ace 3 and ace 4, and I block hands that would be calling me at a higher frequency like ace 10. So I thought my hand was probably a little bit weaker strength than it was, but I think I can probably put a bet out here, even if it's just a small sizing, and try to get called by 10x at some frequency. I do think there's hands like king 10, queen 10, jack 10 that make up a large portion of my opponent's range. The loose player checks back and we win at showdown. The looser player to my left showed the jack of hearts, 5 of hearts, had middling pair, picked up a flush draw. That kind of makes sense to get to this point if he did call pre-flop, and the early position limper ended up having ace 10, so I probably lost a little bit of value in this spot. In this hand, we have multiple limpers, early position limps, the low jack limps, a reg limps, cutoff limps, button limps, and I decide to overlimp for $2 with 4-3 of hearts. I think this is perfectly fine, getting very good pot odds. I don't expect the looser, older player to my left to really be raising unless he has a strong hand. He had a propensity to want to see flops, so I think getting this price, it makes it pretty easy to throw in $2. He does check. The flop is the ace of diamonds, 4 of clubs, 3 of diamonds, and the pot is $21. I decide to lead into the field for $15. I think for the most part, when I'm leading into the field like this with this many players, I'm going to be relatively polarized, probably using slightly larger sizes even though we are multi-way, but I'm only really doing this with very good bluffs and strong value hands. The looser player on my left calls the 15 and it gets to the reg and the hijack. He raises it to $70 and it folds back around to me. I think both options are probably fine for me here. I can raise or I can call, definitely not folding. I block a lot of his value hands like ace 4, ace 3, pocket 4s, pocket 3s. I wouldn't expect him for the most part to have hands like 5 deuce suited here. So I think for the most part, I'm probably good and I have the strongest hand. There's definitely a lot of draws here, flush draws and straight draws. I think my hand is definitely for the polarized range that I'm betting into the field slightly on the weaker side. I expect myself to be raising a lot of my stronger ace X pre-flop. So I have hands like straights, possibly some pocket 3s, pocket 4s, and possibly some ace 4, ace 3 style of hands here that are going to be a little bit stronger. But I think with my relatively polarized flop lead, I think I just am fine calling here. So I do that. The big blind elects to fold. The turn is the 9 of spades. This is a card that shouldn't really change either person's range at all. It doesn't really interact with any of the bluffs, and none of the value hands really care about the 9 of spades. I check and flow, and the hijack bets $90. Again, I think I can probably raise or call. I think versus large sizes, I generally lean towards call. With him using this smaller size, I think that it definitely makes it so that my hand is a more viable raise, but I think generally my call is going to be my preference here. It'll kind of allow him to continue to bluff, and it'll allow him to continue to bet with some of his stronger ace X holdings. I can essentially pick off a lot of bluffs on the river. So I elect to call. The river is the 7 of diamonds, which is arguably one of the worst cards in the deck. Flush draws complete here, and the most obvious straight draw, which is 6-5, completes as well. I check to him. He decides to check back pretty quickly. He shows ace-8 offsuit, which I'm a little bit surprised to see, especially from a more reg style of player. I don't think this is a spot where he really should be essentially merge raising for the most part. I would think that he wants to be a little bit stronger with this many players getting to the flop and go a little bit more polarized. I think especially versus my range that has a lot of hands that are much stronger than him. I think this is a little bit on the edge for him to raise on the flop. I think if he does continue on the turn, it probably should be for a small sizing, so I think that's fine if he does decide to continue. But I think he's in a spot where he's kind of putting himself in trouble a little bit game theory wise when I have some stronger ace-x than him. But his thought process might be as well that the vast majority of my stronger ace-x is going to be raising pre-flop, so it's probably fine. But we scoop a $356 pot. We have another button straddle in this hand. The small blind calls, the big blind calls. A younger kid that just recently sat down at the table, he opens from under the gun to 20, and I look down at 6 of spades, 5 of spades. I think generally this is just going to be a fold versus the under the gun range, but I think when the under the gun player elects to raise this small in a straddle pot with other money that's already been put in there, and in a spot where I don't expect a lot of the players from behind to 3-bet, I think I'm okay calling the 6 of spades, 5 of spades here. So I do elect to call. Folds to the hijack, they call. It gets around to the straddle, they call, and small blind just calls. And we go to a flop for $106. The flop is 10-9-3 rainbow. Small blind checks. The initial raiser checks here. I would expect him to be betting a lot of his overpairs, his sets here, his 10x. I think in a live game, a lot of his nut hands are essentially removed once he checks here. It gets to me, I think this is a pretty just pure check here. We really just want to be betting here with stronger hands and bluffs that have good nut potential. Here I have a backdoor straight and not even a backdoor flush, so pretty easy check. It checks around. The turn is the 4 of hearts, which is a very interesting card. The small blind checks, the initial raiser checks, and it gets to me. So the 4 of hearts is specifically a card where my hand gains a lot of equity. My hand actually makes a very interesting bluff here because I think, one, I have relatively good implied odds if I do hit my hand. I have a relatively strong draw, and my specific combo, not being a heart draw, unblocks a lot of the calling range on the turn that is going to fold to a second barrel from me on the river whenever hearts miss, which is going to be the majority of the time. So I do elect to bet here 55 into 106. It folds around to the initial pre-flop raiser and he makes the call. Interesting call from him. Again, I think he's like relatively capped when he checks the flop and then checks the turn, even though we're this multi-way. I think players are generally betting a lot of their stronger hands even when they should be slow playing them on these spots, and players rarely trap check twice. So I think a lot of his range is going to be kind of medium pocket pairs, some 9x, and then he might have some straight draws with some overcards. He might have some flush draws, but I think for the most part he's going to be relatively capped. The river is the 4 of diamonds. He checks, and I think this is pretty much just a mandatory bet from me versus his range that's relatively capped. I think a lot of my 10x can bet here. I would have been checking that with players behind on the flop. I think I have some 2-pair combos here, mostly going to be like 10-9. And then I also have some sets here. And then again, the heart draws missed, so I think it's a spot where I unblock a lot of the folding range. I bet 175 and he pretty much snap folds and he shows the king queen with the king of hearts. This is going to be another straddle pot. Couple new players at this table. One of the other tables recently broke. We're going to call this player that straddled young guns. The early position unknown player, he limps. The reg from earlier has moved to my right now. He over limps and I open pocket jacks to 40 in the low jack. It folds to the cutoff and a younger good reg that I've played with once or twice elects to call, and it gets back to the big blind, looser middle-aged player. He elects to call, the initial straddler calls, and both limpers call. So we get 5 callers and we go to a flop of $240 with pocket jacks. Thankfully, the flop is the king of hearts, king of clubs, jack of spades, so we flop a full house here. It checks to me. I elect to bet 100 into 240. I think generally I'm going to be using smaller sizes multi-way here. I'm generally going to be using smaller sizes on paired boards as well. I think in this specific spot I could probably go a little bit larger because I think some of these slightly more connected Broadway paired boards are going to be connecting with my opponents a little bit better than some of the lower paired boards. The young reg calls 100 and the rest of the players fold. The turn is the biggest blank in the deck, the 2 of diamonds. I think I am almost exclusively going to be using large sizes on this turn card. I think I have a relatively polarized range, especially betting multi-way on the flop. So I'm going to have some straight draws, I'm going to have pocket jacks, and I'm going to have strong king X. I elect to overbet for 550 into about 440. Really just trying to maximize any value that I can get from a king X here. I think a large portion of my opponent's range is going to be king X. There's definitely going to be some straight draws that I might miss a little bit of value against in this spot, but I think generally I want to maximize against kings. Thankfully, we see him shove all in for approximately 1100. We snap call. The river is the 7 of clubs, another blank. I show my pocket jacks and he flashes the king of spades and mucks, and we scoop a huge pot to end the session. Another massive session for the start of the vlog series, $2,510 win at 1-3. So hopefully the run good continues.